Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Thorsten, and thank you, Mikkel, for sharing. So good evening, everybody. Welcome to this meetup, and thank you again, Thorsten and Lisa, for the opportunity to talk about the role of psychological safety in Agile teams. I would like to start by saying that the leaders of this work are certainly Mikkel and Alan, that both of them are here. And I would like to take the opportunity once more to thank them as well as Practio to give me the opportunity to engage with this topic. Now, the outlook of this event is fairly straightforward. Mikkel, if you can, yeah. There will be an introduction of the topic to set the stage. Then we're going to move into the history and evolution of psychological safety. We will go into the details about the piece of research that we did with Alan at Practio, and we will close by giving you some teasers about future direction we are taking this work towards. And as you can see, we have some planned activities. We have specifically 2 breakout rooms that will be executed, and the third interaction that will give you the opportunity to try out an instrument to measure psychological safety that we have tested with Practio. So before jumping into all of this, let's look a moment about information about the setup that we believe to be a moment important so that everybody is on the same page. Today, we're going to be using Miro during the breakout room. I expect that most of you are familiar with the technology, but we will go through a few details about it and breakout room in Zoom. So in Miro, the only feature that you will need, the link will come later, but the only feature that you will need is the ability to copy or create a card. Yes, there was a question, or somebody just, okay. So the ability to copy or create a card. To do so, you can select an existing copy and use your favorite technique to copy paste an item on a computer, and that will create a card. You have already 2 templates, or you will have already 2 templates on the page that will be shared with you. And to create a connection between them, if you select one of them, you'll see that there are some dots that will show up on the side of the card. Mikkel, if you can show that. If you select a card, you'll see that there is a dot that appears on the side. Maybe this is not visible to you, but once you click the dot, then you will be able to click on the target, and that will create an arrow connecting 2 cards. This is just everything you need about Miro, to know about Miro. We'll use it during the breakout room. Regarding breakout rooms themselves, we have a bit of a specific special setup here. So we're not going to do automatic setup because, as Thorsten explained at the beginning, there is a coordination practice here at AgilityLab by which we allow you to say no in front of your name. So if you don't want to join the breakout rooms, you can prefix your name by putting no. And in that way, you'll not be automatically placed in them. But that means that I need to manually place you in a room, and we're going to have 2 sessions, and we hope to keep the groups as close to the, as consistent as possible throughout this 2 sessions. Yes. Now, to do that, the only thing that I ask you to make sure you take care of is to put the no in front of the name if you wish, and remember the room number in which you get in case there is an issue. So we will create the breakout rooms for you. We will assign you to the breakout rooms. And when they are created, if there is a problem, once everybody will be in the rooms, we will do troubleshooting. So you just unmute and ask and say, there is a problem. Can you help me with that? Okay, this is all about the setup. Now let's get to the actual presentation. One word on who am I? You might be asking that. I'm an associate professor at the IT University of Copenhagen here in Denmark. I've been a member of AgilityLab since 2015, and I'm actually an assistant organizer, even though lately I have to say that I've not been active at all. Let me use the excuse of COVID. The reason why I love this meetup is that I am fascinated by the ability to collaborate, to create network between industry and academia. And that's exactly what we're trying to do also here today. My research focus are various, but primarily, especially recently, I'm focusing specifically on software processes, and I would say hybrid software processes, software process improvement, and the like. If you wish to contact me, you have the email on the slide. This is all I would like to say about me. So today's presentation will be mainly managed by Mikkel, and I'll let Mikkel introduce himself.
Thank you so much, Paolo. Yeah, my name is Mikkel. Hi to everyone. I am rather new here, but it's great to see you all, and thank you for turning up. So I am a full stack developer by trade, and that's what I do, but I am simultaneously also a master's student at the IT University of Copenhagen, where I collaborate with Paolo and Alan and others. And my research focus is strongly on, well, anything agile methods, teamwork, and as relevant to the topic today, namely psychological safety. And so to start this whole thing off, I want to tell you a little story. So a couple of years back, I had just gotten a new job as a full stack developer. And the first task I was assigned was building a sort of calendar type component for the company's web app. This was reasonably well described, and I knew how the functionality would play out. I had some computer science background from university. I had some work experience. I thought it was going to go great. And it did for the most part, but a problem arose. And it was small and simple. And I started spending a little bit time on it, 1 hour, 2 hours, and suddenly the day was gone. And I just couldn't solve this simple problem. And I just really did not want to hand in this piece of work, my first task, with such an obvious but simple small flaw. So I showed up to work the next day, and almost the entire day passed before I finally caved and asked for help. And I want to show you a picture of the issue that kept me for days. Here it is. As I'm hoping you all can tell, it's right there. What kept me up for so long was a small pixel misalignment in this calendar. As you can see, the header of Tuesday does not align with the rest of the calendar. We were using a special rendering system. I just could not force it to align on different screen sizes. And this might, you might say that's not so bad, but I really truly did not want to hand this in because I knew that the first thing my superior was going to see was this misalignment. And well, when I finally fessed up the courage to ask the question, it turned out that another developer who had been hired just weeks before me had the exact same problem. And when I spoke to them, we solved it in less than an hour. And so today I'm hoping to talk to you about, well, why does this happen? And as I also teased in the description of this talk, this meetup, well, Amy Edmondson, who is the author of all this, I'll speak more about her later, but she found out that, well, it turns out no one really wants to show up to work looking ignorant, incompetent, intrusive, or negative. And, well, how do we avoid that? Well, it's actually really easy for us because you just don't ask questions if you don't want to look ignorant. You don't admit to mistakes. You don't offer ideas, and you don't challenge the status quo. And in my case, I really didn't want to ask questions because I thought this simple CSS thing was something I should know. And I was afraid that I would look incompetent if I admitted to it. And, well, the solution to all of this is the term that we've now coined psychological safety. But before we delve too much into what that actually entails, I want to leave you with this kind of situation and these factors and have you move into these breakout rooms and try and have a discussion among your peers about whether such a situation has occurred to you, maybe someone you know, somebody you've worked with, and primarily, if such a situation occurred, what was the reason that someone held back in that situation? We will. This is where the Miro board will come in. So we will hopefully get some breakout rooms set up, and you will be assigned to them. And with your teammates, you can try and discuss this and put your cards on Miro. So we have a lovely little column here on Miro that you can put your cards into. There's already an example here outlining the issue that I just talked about. But feel free to get creative and discuss with your team. So we will do that. I will put up a 10-minute timer in Miro, and when we're done with that, we will get back to the presentation.
People will be coming back. I have closed the rooms some 40 seconds ago, so it's going to take a moment for everybody to be back. Um,
All right. Welcome back, everyone. I hope that was doable. We will leave the cards and the situations now. I promise we will return to them later. But I hope everything went well. So now that we've talked a little bit about the challenging situations and the issues that we might experience in a work environment, and I teased a little bit before this that, you know, maybe the solution to some of this is psychological safety. Maybe we should talk a little bit more about what that actually is. So psychological safety is a term that is mostly attributed to Amy Edmondson here.
Slide.
Excuse me?
Share the slide.
Oh, right. I disconnected. I apologize. I will share the slides again. There. Is that visible?
Yes.
Fantastic. I apologize for that. So yes, as I spoke about, Amy Edmondson. And Amy Edmondson was a behavioral scientist, or is a behavioral scientist, who in the late 90s did a lot of research, primarily in the field of medicine, but was interested in the factors of teams and teamwork and team efficiency and team error rates. And what she found out was that this term of psychological safety, which she called an individual's perception of the consequences of taking an interpersonal risk, was everywhere. And she further clarified that she said that psychological safety is about avoiding being punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes. And I added here within a group because she further clarifies that psychological safety is a group construct. It's an individual's perception of their safety within that group. And she speaks about interpersonal risk here, which is an interesting term, but it is fundamentally any interpersonal action that could be risky in the given group context. So for example, as we spoke about before, not being afraid to challenge the status quo, that's taking a risk, asking for help or admitting a mistake, all these kind of things are interpersonal risks. And so this is what psychological safety is in its definition. But does that mean that this is our ideal situation? Is, you know, what we want our work team to be, just an environment that is comfortable and safe and easygoing, where we're all really happy and smiling like these people are around the bonfire? Well, maybe some parts of that. We probably want to be happy, but this is not where we're aiming for. Because psychological safety is not about letting go of the gas. It's about letting off the brakes. It's about removing those things that impede us. And so a point that we need to consider is that psychological safety is not about being comfortable. And so we have this great graphic here on the right where we actually say, well, maybe psychological safety and comfort are two completely different elements, and they're actually different axes in this diagram. And if you are in an environment that is very psychologically safe and you also are very, very comfortable, you hear how people go nowhere. And that's not a very productive environment. It's an environment where you're comfortable, you're complacent, maybe you're content, but you're not innovating. And instead, we actually probably want to be down here, where we have a high degree of psychological safety, but we aren't necessarily comfortable all the time. We're okay with being challenged, with things changing and learning and making mistakes. And there's a fantastic expression for this, which is actually that it's not about being comfortable. It's about having comfort with dissent. So the idea of being comfortable with being uncomfortable, essentially, comfortable with challenges, with taking leaps, risks, and learning from them. Another factor of it is that psychological safety should not come at the cost of accountability. It's not about, you know, as we saw in sitting around the bonfire, that you have to be very cozy and kind all the time necessarily. Psychological safety, in fact, enables accountability because it's about opening up and having conversations. And in being respectful and open, you should also rather feel psychologically safe to call out disrespectful behavior, or even other people's mistakes, or even perhaps poor performance, which is another common thing that is discussed when it comes to psychological safety. Well, how does it relate to performance exactly? And so, you know, I think a lot of us have probably experienced that if you work in a tech team or something like that, that there's a tendency that working on any kind of the softer human factors can be seen as a time sink. It's something that you do outside of just doing your job. And I will guess that most of you have had experiences with maybe a developer, and you have a conversation about them with, why are we having a retrospective? And you can see that in his brain, he's just thinking, let me go back to coding. Well, the idea here is that psychological safety should not be a trade-off for performance at all. In fact, as we can see of this graphic, high psychological safety can actually afford high performance. And so the axis at the bottom here says accountability. And the reason that that's there is because an environment of, or a culture of performance is one where you're held accountable for your performance. So when we talk about psychological safety on the group level as a construct, we're not necessarily interested in whether or not individuals are performing, but more how is performance viewed as the culture. And in this case, we're viewing it as accountability of performance. And if you are in a really, really high performance zone with tons of people performing well, but also being held accountable for performing well, but your psychological safety does not match, then you end up in the anxiety zone down here on the right. And to some extent, that's where I was when I told you my story initially of trying to complete my first task at the job, because I was afraid of, to some extent, of asking those questions, because I wanted to look like I was performing really well, and I wanted to be held accountable as somebody who performed well. But if your performance follows your psychological safety levels, you instead end up here in the learning zone, where you have high performance and high accountability of performance in your culture, but you also have extremely high psychological safety to boot. And this is where you're not afraid of running fast. You're not afraid of high performance and holding people's feet to the fire, but you're also acknowledging that it is a learning environment and there's room to run fast and make mistakes and learn from them. I can see there's some interaction in the chat.
It's all fine. The question was whether you will touch upon. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. All right. If there's any questions at any time, feel free to either ask them in the chat or interrupt me if it's important, or whatever you feel. Right. So, you know, actually funny that you mentioned it. We've talked about now a lot of why psychological safety is important, what it is, what parts it contains. So the next natural question is, well, how do we get there? How do we improve psychological safety, and how do we achieve a high level of psychological safety? And so Amy Edmondson, the author here, speaks about 3 common points. And these are fairly general, but they're very powerful. So the first point that Edmondson makes is that inherently framing the work as a learning problem is a big factor of how to achieve high psychological safety. And she says that there's an enormous uncertainty ahead, and we need to utilize the full brain power of our team. That's sort of the goal that she has in mind. And I think this is true even more so for Agile, the world of Agile teams. You know, if the primary case for Scrum and why it was made was that we wanted to have a framework for an exploratory approach where we don't necessarily know all the steps to creating value, but we want to try iteratively getting there. And so in framing the work as a learning problem, you acknowledge that the reason that I have not yet built the best code in the world or have finished my task or whatever it might be, it's not that you are not competent or that you necessarily haven't spent the time, but it's that there is stuff to learn. There are things to learn. You will get smarter with time. And anyone who's worked iteratively have probably realized that over time and over iterations, you learn things that makes work subsequently easier and better. And so Edmondson argues that it's about framing the work in this way, acknowledging that this is how work actually is, that it's about learning and the learning opportunities you have. And speaking of learning opportunities, she talks about acknowledging fallibility, because mistakes are a learning opportunity. Experimentation inherently brings with it mistakes that are learning opportunities. And a big factor of psychological safety is that we're able to acknowledge these among each other as colleagues or as peers, but especially also from superiors. So she gives a lot of examples of really powerful statements of psychological safety is when a leader is able to openly talk to their team about mistakes they've made in the past, things they have learned, or in general, opening a general culture of accepting and learning from mistakes. Yeah, and finally, her third point here is that she talks about that now modeling curiosity. And by that, she means essentially, well, ask a lot of questions. And that might be fairly obvious, but the important part is that asking a question creates a necessity for voice. If you ask somebody a question, you are inviting them into participating in your conversation about psychological safety. So if you tie this to the other 2 points, if you ask somebody, instead of asking them, have you done this task that I needed done on Monday? You can talk about framing the work as a learning problem. So in Scrum, for example, we ask what's impeding you. Maybe you can frame that in a way of what you need to learn to get to where you want to be. The same thing goes for fallibility. If you ask questions about mistakes, you can get to in a state of acknowledging them by modeling curiosity about them, asking questions about the mistakes, the subject matter, the process, the solutions, and all the learning opportunities therein. I think there was a great question in the chat. Okay. We will circle.
The question is, if you wish to take it now, it's what boundaries are to be respected while improving psychological safety?
That's a really great question. So the boundaries to be respected. So the challenge with anything related to improving psychological safety is that you gotta first kind of estimate where you are already. So an improvement state will look very different if you're trying to move a quite psychologically safe environment to an even more safe, versus one that's extremely unsafe. And so the boundaries will be attached to that kind of distinction. One of the things we thought a lot about is, the irony of the term psychological safety is that if you ask someone, do you feel psychologically safe? Most likely they will now feel a little uncomfortable. And so the boundaries to be respected will depend very, very much on whether they are very comfortable talking about these things already. If that's a conversation that has not yet been opened up in your team or company, there are much softer introductions to it. But in general, the boundaries on it should be just a step above the ladder of where you already are. And I think that all of these principles, which are very general, can be applied to most of those steps. And hopefully we will circle a little bit back to that in the presentation, and you'll have a chance to discuss it as well in a further breakout. But if you still are unsure about this or have further questions, please definitely ask them at the Q&A at the end. It's a really good question. Yeah, somebody says that she mentioned how she doesn't think it's the greatest name for the term. Yes, I would concur with that. That's a good point. Right. Well, questions aside, we've now talked a little bit about what psychological safety is, where it comes from, the origins, and now a little bit about how we improve psychological safety. And so with these very 3 simple rules in mind, that are framing the work as a learning problem, acknowledging fallibility, and trying to model curiosity within your team, we're going to have a little breakout session again. And what we're going to do is we're going to have a short discussion within the same groups where you will pick a situation from the Miro board. It can be the one you wrote yourself or one of the other teams. And what I would like you to do is you take this situation and you ask your team the question, what elements of psychological safety could be used to foster a better environment for that situation?
68.
All right. Welcome back. I hope that all worked out well for you. There seems to be some good activity on the Miro board. And so now we've talked about situations, we've talked about psychological safety, and we've talked about how to improve it. And I wanted to just ask publicly here if there's any good discussions that went on in your breakout room about your situation or its improvement that you want to share. It would be really great to have some input about what you discussed. There's a lot of good stuff on Miro, so maybe some of the authors would like to talk about their thoughts.
Sorry.
No worries. Thanks.
So here I am. I'm just gonna get this rolling. We talked about basically a lot about pharmaceutical companies and doctors and hospitals, and it's interesting how Edmondson also starts out her research in the hospital setting. So maybe this is extremely likely of doctors and really well-educated people to have this kind of strict structure within organizations. And we talked about how when there is this strict structure, it's always hard to build psychological safety, and some of our group members shared some experiences. And in the second round, we talked about how we think it's really important for executive management and top management to decide for the importance of psychological safety, and then not only just like give it out as a task or something to take on a board, but to actually educate the middle managers about its importance and how to carry it out, because the middle managers are the people who are going to carry out the culture or the aspects of psychological safety that are important to embrace. So we talked about that, and modeling the behaviors themselves. So listening up and sharing their fallibility or even vulnerability, which is a whole other topic, but just sharing how they are also living in this complex world that isn't, you know, where you can't be mistaken, because the world is so complex and most of the work that we do is so complex and interconnected. Mistakes are bound to happen. It's just human nature. And so these middle managers have to show how they are also fallible. And Edmondson also mentioned in one of the interviews that she's given that perhaps instead of a speaking up culture, we need to promote a listening up culture, so that even if people speak up but they're interrupted and they are not listened to fully, they will not embrace speaking up. So rather than saying, you know, you all should speak up, we should create a listening up kind of culture where we tell the managers to listen to their employees or their colleagues. So
very interesting. Thank you.
We were actually discussing what if it is the manager who is causing this culture of not having psychological safety. What can you then actually do? And we actually wanted to ask your perspective on this and your experience with it. But the solution that we discussed, that now that we are agile, we are actually the whole team behind a person. So together as a team, we can actually face this kind of culture. But it is actually kind of difficult when it's the manager causing this problem.
Absolutely. That's a really good question. And, you know, I think that a lot of this safety is, we talked about acknowledging fallibility coming from a top-down point, and it is certainly something we'll touch a little bit more upon later. If you have a question for it, I would happily maybe take it in the Q&A section, but it's definitely a challenging situation, and the leadership plays a big role in psychological safety. So we'll perhaps circle back to that. So I just wanted to give a little bit of a summary so far of where we are. Well, you know, we've talked about psychological safety and how psychological safety is, well, it's a group construct that's foundational to most human interaction. And it's a construct wherein we should feel safe to take risks, to learn, and to challenge the status quo. And psychological safety is about enabling us to do our best, not necessarily being our most comfortable. And through that, it's a driver for learning and performance. So that's a little bit about psychological safety. And, you know, we teased a little bit here that we're going to look into the world of medicine for some inspiration. But what about in the world of software engineering? And that's the background that I have, and I'm sure some of you are also in that realm. And so actually, really interestingly, after Amy Edmondson started out, 15 years later, Google conducted a study called Aristotle. And in that study, they researched, well, what makes a team effective? And team effectiveness is a whole another discussion, but they described it as a mix of self-evaluation and sales quota measurements. And they found that across 118 international teams, psychological safety was the #1 predictor of software team efficiency. And actually, maybe even more fascinating than that, they looked into a lot of other factors first. And they found that all of these factors were not as significant as psychological safety. And many of these factors, I'm sure that you've seen or thought about in other work contexts, such as, you know, sitting together in the same office, or making consensus-driven decision-making, workload size, or the seniority of the team members. All of these paled in comparison to the psychological safety of the team being the #1 predictor. I think, give me once. No, okay, well, we'll keep going on here. Sorry, my internet connection is jumping in and out a little. So if we're aware that psychological safety is really important, well, how do we actually affect change in psychological safety? How do we get there? Well, I am sorry to say I must disappoint you a little bit, because very little research on affecting psychological safety has actually been conducted so far. And especially in the world of software engineering, it's very limited. However, this is exactly what we are working towards right now. And so I will now go into telling you a little bit about our research and what we are doing and how we're trying to, well, figure out how do we actually improve and affect change in psychological safety. So the past half year-ish, we worked on a case study with Allan Epdrup at Praxio, which is a Danish software company, actually funny enough working in the field of medicine as well, so there's an overlap. And we had this really fun project with what we called an explorative shotgun approach, ideally just going in, trying to see how can we start talking about psychological safety in the context of software. And more importantly, how can we measure what the current level of psychological safety is? And to do this, we actually adapted a tool from the healthcare domain, which I'll get back to. And secondly, well, how do we affect these levels? If we know that a team is here, well, how do we get them hopefully upwards? And so to start off, we had this the survey tool that we borrowed from the medical domain. This is a survey that was designed in 2020, so fairly new research, which was assessed as over multiple iterations by a team of doctors to assess the levels of psychological safety in a hospital team. And so we thought, well, you know, they've tested it out, they've tried it many times. How does that apply in the world of software engineering? And so that was step one. And, you know, I think I promised this in the description of the event today, that I would give you access to some tools that you yourself can use to try and assess the levels of psychological safety in your team. So that is exactly what we will do. You will be given a link to this survey that you can answer. And the really cool part about this survey is that it's very simple. It's quite straightforward, and there's no prerequisite for knowing anything about psychological safety to take this survey. Now, obviously, you are all positioned a little better than that at this point in the meetup, but it can be used with almost any team. And we will actually now just take a short 5 minutes where you'll be given the link in the Zoom chat, and you can fill out the survey. The survey will ask you some questions about your team. So that can either be a place of employment currently, or maybe a past team, or really in relation to any team that you want. But it's mainly a chance for you to try and check out this tool and try and see how it is used to assess levels of psychological safety. So we will take a short 5 minutes time for just filling that out, and then we'll discuss a little what the results of that look afterwards. So hopefully you can get the link in the chat and start clicking away.
The link is in the chat, and you don't need to log in or have an account in order to provide the information. The purpose is just for you to see the instrument that we used, and later on you will have access to it if you wish. So it's completely anonymous.
And so we have a whopping 49 responses. So thank you so much for that. And what's really interesting is, and I don't know if you noticed this, is that there's actually sections in this survey, and the sections ask you to direct your questions in regards to either the team as a whole or the team leader. And so as somebody previously asked in a question, you know, the role of the team leader is very key to the concept of psychological safety. And this is the reason for the distinction in these two. And what you will actually see in a bit when I show you some of how we use the survey is you can see how those scores come into play. And if you just scroll through quickly, it's quite easy to see that we have a pretty big spread in here. And I think this is something that you will find. We are obviously representing a multitude of work environments and workplaces. Luckily, we're leaning a little on the better side, but it's very easy to scroll through this and identify problem scenarios, identify, well, where are the ones being given to which questions, and is it in regard to the team leader? And this kind of survey is actually fairly actionable. And so the output of it is hopefully something that maybe you can use with your teams to try and get a feel for, well, where's the problem, or are there any problems? And so this kind of survey is exactly what we used. You got a little bit of a simple subset of it, but in largely this was exactly the survey that we used. And I hope you all had an easy time filling it out. It is meant to be fairly straightforward. And yeah. This survey we used, I'll hop back here, to do a couple of things. So first thing we did was we did exactly what we just did with you guys, is that we tried to say, well, what is the level of psychological safety in this team? Now we could do that analysis of your responses as well, but we will spare you the time on that, and maybe you can do that on your own. I can definitely send out the survey afterwards. After that, we tried to affect some change. And we did this through something we called an awareness workshop, which I'll get back to in a minute. And then finally, we reused the exact same survey measure to try and measure, well, did we move the needle? Did we improve? Did we make it a better environment after a couple of weeks? And so I want to show you the results from our survey. And so we had oh, that's coming on a bit, my bad. First, I want to tell you about the awareness workshop. So as I mentioned, we had a measurement, an intervention, and then a measurement again. And our intervention in the middle, where we tried to affect change in psychological safety, was an awareness workshop. And so this was a digital event with the entire company. And the core goal of this awareness workshop was, and I can't remember who said this originally, but putting a hat on the monkey, which I thought was a great expression. The idea of putting a word to something that most people have experienced, but maybe they haven't talked about in that way. And the reason we tried to have that goal is that once we kind of started learning about psychological safety, when we were reading about it and getting into Amy's stuff, is that we kind of reflected backwards and said, well, this meeting I had 2 weeks ago, I was feeling really tense and I didn't really know why. Oh, I was actually afraid to ask a question because I was afraid of looking negative, or I was afraid of looking incompetent. And suddenly we unraveled a lot of past experiences under the guise of psychological safety. And so we wanted to offer this up for all of the team members and see, well, can the simple concept of being made more aware of what psychological safety is enable a discussion that might improve psychological safety? And so what we did with them is actually very much akin to what we did today, in that we informed them about the concept and we identified with them challenging situations that they had experienced in their work life. And so today, you know, we were not going to track you down and figure out where you work, but this is actually a pretty vulnerable situation when you're talking about a company that you're currently working in. And so the requirement for such a... Right. So the survey results, I'm not 100% sure where I cut out. So I will just reiterate that we had a survey. We had an awareness workshop where we tried to spread awareness of the concepts of psychological safety in order to see whether awareness alone simply could improve psychological safety in the teams. And then we remeasured using the same survey. And this is the output. And you can see that each column here corresponds to a section in the survey, namely that there's a psychological safety towards the team leader, towards other team members, and towards the team as a whole. And these were all factors that we measured and calculated, and you have simple mean of the scores. So as you noticed before when you were filling out, simple 1 to 7 score of strongly disagree to strongly agree. And we very interestingly found out that, first of all, the levels of psychological safety in these teams were quite high. As you'll notice, most of them range in the 5 to 6 area. But also something interesting happened, namely that, you know, one of the teams, as you can see by the color coding, went up and one of the teams went down a little. And you might wonder why that is. And we'll get into that then. But first of all, I wanted to just say that we, as I mentioned earlier, we adapted this survey from the healthcare domain. And we had a lot of questions about that. I think, as you already mentioned, you know, in the healthcare domain, if there's a stronger hierarchy, maybe there's doctors, there's different positions, and does that really relate to the world of software engineering? And so with very limited adaptations, I think we actually saw a very successful adaptation in the software domain, where both we and the participants in the survey felt that it was a successful reflection of the way the company worked, and that the scoring of the questions really seemed to correctly reflect the situation as it was assessed by us and them, which is good, because that means the tool is hopefully doing what it was intended to do. Now, circling back to the results, we had one team decrease by around 1 standard deviation and another team increase by around 1 standard deviation. And so graphically, it seems that there was some kind of middle point between these two teams, where they, before the workshop was a bigger gap between them, they moved closer to some kind of tendency. And that was kind of curious. You know, we were going into this in an exploratory manner. These are not a lot of data points, but we wanted to try and say, well, how on earth could this be? And so one of our hypotheses coming out of this data is that it actually seemed that maybe awareness of psychological safety did improve psychological safety slightly, but perhaps it also increased identification of problem scenarios slightly. You know, a personal experience we'd had a lot was that, as I mentioned earlier, that the more we learned about the subject, the more we reflected on past experiences. And once we got better and better at identifying situations that had to do with psychological safety. I personally, at least, have in my work experience brought it out numerous times since then, is that, you know what, the reason this meeting right now is tense and complicated is because I'm not asking the question. And then maybe I ask the question, or maybe I ask someone else to ask the question. But perchance, if they have identified more of these problematic scenarios, they will have identified those in the survey as well. And as a result, their psychological safety levels could have gone down. So we actually, in addition to these, we actually made some observations as well. So we observed a bunch of their stand-up events as a team. We tried to measure some objective metrics about how they interacted, whether they were making jokes or were being constructive, or if there was negative or vibes or just like angry discussion, or all these kind of interesting points. And something that was really interesting to us was that in their stand-ups, the word psychological safety started popping up. Sometimes it wasn't a joke, sometimes it was in conversation, but we actually even had a participant ask, is anyone worried about anything? And so we can probably not take full credit for whether that was a direct result of the awareness workshop, but the interesting thing was that perhaps we had succeeded in putting a hat on the monkey, as it were, given that the term actually started arising in their discussions, which was fantastic. But as I mentioned, this was an exploratory introductory case for us. And so there are some limitations of it. First of all, we're talking about a single case. We had two teams, but it's the same company. And they had very high levels of psychological safety. And so, you know, that might change a lot of things. And secondly, we tried a single intervention. We decided on this awareness workshop based on our own experience, but is that the best tool for improving psychological safety? Well, these exact questions are what we're working on right now. So what we are working on currently is trying to expand this, trying to involve more companies into more cases, into more teams, and trying out a myriad of different tools for working with psychological safety. Now, what do I mean by tool? Well, we're trying to research tools that teams can use to include working with psychological safety as part of their practice. So as part of what your teams do on the daily, we want to try and sew psychological safety into that. And what we're actually working on is designing some different kind of tools that teams can use that are either simple additions to current events they might already have, such as stand-ups or retrospectives, touching base on psychological safety in those events, or even technical practices such as code reviews or pair programming. And in fact, we're even trying to experiment with some new events, which are some really interesting simulation-based exercises where we are exposing participants to some pretty challenging psychologically safe, some situations that challenge psychological safety pretty hard, but are allowed because it's a simulation-based exercise. And those we've tried those in the past and have really great experiences with those as well. So that's what we're working on right now. And all of these are trying to hit the goals that we've been working with so far through this talk, about framing the work as a learning problem, acknowledging fallibility, and modeling curiosity. If this is something you find interesting and you might want to get involved in, I just wanted to give you a short timetable here. We are now in March. This is the AgilityLab talk. And on the 6th of April, we'll be having a workshop with a lot of industry practitioners, agile coaches, and more, talking about some of the things that we've been talking about today, but trying to convert them into more actionable tools that we can maybe use for working with psychological safety as a part of our everyday work. After this, we'll have a period in April and May where we're trying to do some tool evaluation with a bunch of software teams that are going to participate and try out one to many of these different tools in practice and see how they work. If you're interested in participating in this kind of work, you will get to work with a lot of other industry practitioners on identifying key challenges with psychological safety. But most importantly, you can become part of designing actionable tools that software teams can use to improve psychological safety. And, you know, I think this is something that has been asked questions about already tonight, but it's really the core of where we are right now, is that we've identified that it's crucial and important, but we're trying really hard to find out how we can make actionable points on affecting psychological safety. Now, that's the workshop. Maybe you also want to participate in the tool evaluation. And this is a really cool experience for your teams to get to work with this concept, which has been proven to be one of the biggest generators of software teams. However, you know, not many teams are actually working on it. So you can become part of doing that. And you can do it in a very flexible manner, be part of designing and using the tools in the way that fits your company or your team. And our past experience with these kind of projects actually show that, as I mentioned before, is a really good way of kickstarting the discussion about psychological safety in your workplace or in your team, which can be a really good start to working with all of this. Now, if you're actually interested in participating, I will leave this in the slide deck that you will get later. Here's some practicalities about how to get involved if you're interested, but I will skip through that slide and just leave it so you can revisit it later. And I hope you've enjoyed this presentation so far and that you feel psychologically safe and that you're ready to model even more curiosity, because I think that's where we'll leave it and head into some Q&A. So thank you for your time and your ears.
Can you go back one slide, please?
Absolutely. I will leave this with you afterwards, so you will have everything you need for it.
Thank you.
Okay. Yep. Thank you. So thank you, Mikkel. And now I guess that we move into the Q&A part, and Mikkel go back to the previous one so that she can take a note if she needs.
Oh, yes, apologize.
So there have been, I took note of the questions that popped up during the third part of the session. And I think there are some very interesting one. First, I think it's, there is a long comment for you by Thomas about references that are relevant, which you might want to take a look at. Mm-hmm. But taking two questions, Liza was saying, you take for granted that an Agile team has a team lead. Scrum teams don't have that unless you count managers as team leads. Does the instrument work? And I guess Liza can place the question better than I am doing now. But
just wondered, because I filled out the survey, the questionnaire, and I felt really, really irritated. Why all these questions about a team lead? We don't have a team lead, blah, blah, and then moving on saying, So I was wondering, because this talk is about Agile teams, and very many Agile teams work with Scrum, and even without Scrum, there would preferably not be a team lead. So any comments on that? Why do you keep questioning the team lead?
That's a really good question. And so the answer is a bit nuanced, perhaps. So first of all, the original survey is from a medical domain where there is a very well-defined team lead. And so that was something we were quite aware of, and whether that translates at all. Now, the importance of the leadership role is a big part of psychological safety. And so we chose to include it because the teams we worked with, we wanted to see if we had a talk about, well, who is the team leader? Because they were exactly working in a flat hierarchy where that was not obvious. And so we chose to say, well, we believe this person is the team leader for various reasons. And then we wanted to say, well, is there a direct, because a big part of the importance is there a direct difference between the interaction of team members and somebody who has some form of authority? This might not be the case for all teams, and the survey can actually, all of the three categories work on their own. And so those can be excluded if a de facto team lead does not exist. But it's also an invitation to open the conversation about whether there, even in the flattest structure, is some kind of authority or hierarchy, because that is one of the most critical points of psychological safety. Does that answer your question, or do you have more questions?
No, thank you. Yeah, I would not like to use this tool in any of my teams, because it wouldn't work. But that is yeah, just.
I completely agree with you, Liza.
I should also comment that the tool was the one that was used for the study. So the instrument has been adapted from the healthcare environment, but also ported for a specific setup. I guess that because it's such a complicated topic, I think that every single environment would have its own tweak to an instrument like the one that Mikkel has presented. The problem is that if we all modify the instrument, then we're never going to be able to have proper comparison if we wish to go in that direction. So, yeah.
Yeah. And as I briefly touched upon before, this is a subset of the full survey, and the team leader section could theoretically be plugged out, and there would still be some valuable insights to be gained, I believe.
Yeah, that would be my advice. Then it would be a completely other situation. Yeah, then I would really appreciate using this. Yeah.
I see. Thank you.
Yeah, Liza, I'm wondering if I can offer too, instead of seeing it as team lead, you can insert the name Scrum Master, Product Owner, or Leadership, right? So you actually shift it. That way you see whether as a Scrum Master, are you influencing too much? Do they really feel okay to bring that stuff up to me, or are they hiding it?
Yeah, but that's it. We really, nobody is superior to others in such a team yeah, so that would introduce other problems, I think. But very interesting discussions. We could take it offline, I think. Yeah.
It is an interesting discussion, and I think if I remember correctly, the questions in regards to the team lead do not imply authority necessarily. And so it's more about the levels of psychological safety towards a certain person playing a key role, and that might be adaptable to Scrum Masters. Again, we're talking about modifying an instrument, and there's all kinds of other challenges with that, but it might be an option.
I have a question. My name is Junaid, and I just wonder, like, could there be a misuse of extreme of psychological safety? Because in many meetings, we would like to be very conclusive, and somebody can misuse to take the liberty to speak too much or because of that psychological comfort. And I have one more add-on question, which may be touching the same area. There could be, in multicultural teams, there could be cultural issues, because from one particular background, giving a very straight response to your comments in a critical way might have been taken humiliation, while in another culture, it is very, very warmly welcomed because you want to hear in very straight words. So the workshop or things you are mentioning, how you guys will tackle these kind of behavioral issues in multicultural teams? Thank you.
All right, wonderful. Thank you. So there was a kind of twofold question. First, you talked about a situation in which there's a misuse of too much psychological safety, and then about some multicultural challenges. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Wonderful. So I'll address them one at a time. So first, the concept of misuse of psychological safety is an interesting one, because it goes back a little to the idea of accountability in a situation that is psychologically safe. Namely that if an environment truly is psychologically safe, the aim is not necessarily that a person feels open to just letting their heart out and, you know, like playing the guitar at the bonfire. It's also conducive to somebody saying, hey, we only have 10 minutes, or can we get this into an actionable, knowable format, or having a direct conversation and being pretty open to being directly holding people accountable in a way that is relevant to the culture of the company, right? And so the situation you describe absolutely can arise, but it's actually not necessarily where you want to aim with psychological safety. And the extreme end of psychological safety would hopefully more look like a situation in which everyone in that room when that situation occurs feel completely safe to engage with it and talk about it. How do we avoid that situation to the person in the moment that it happens? And so I will answer the second question, then hopefully that was good enough. And also I will refer, Amy Edmondson's, I believe it's her 2004 paper, has a really, I will link this in the slides as well, has a really interesting description of the differences of psychological safety with accountability and trust, and a lot of these terms that feel related, which very much kind of digs into the really deep idea of why psychological safety isn't just everyone being comfortable and doing whatever they want. So multiculturalism is definitely something that plays a big part of this, and different cultures and different backgrounds, no matter whether they're national or what else they might be, it can even be from team to team or company to company, are very different and take psychological safety very differently. And I think this is establishing a culture of good psychological safety will depend entirely on the participants, right? So as I mentioned, it's a group construct, and those can exist within many, many, many groups and subgroups. And it's I don't know if there's a specific, I'm not aware of a specific tool or a specific exercise that tangles multiculturalism in that sense, but it is something that touches the base of this, which is, it's about any interpersonal interaction. And of course, culture is very much in play there.
Thank you very much, Mikkel. Thanks for your views.
Yes, I may just add, so the entire, I mentioned at the beginning that global software engineering was one of my research foci in the past. And if I may say, it's such a complex topic, cultural diversity, no matter whether you take Mintzberg or you take other researchers and line of research, but combining this with psychological safety, given the little that I would say we know about how to work with psychological safety, is maybe a next step. I think first we should try to understand. Of course, you are absolutely right with the fact that depending on the culture, if you're speaking about national culture or organizational culture, this is going to be very impactful. But considering a multicultural setup would I think be an very interesting next step. I want to just take a moment to say I'm pretty certain that Thorsten and Liza will agree with sharing the chat, which at this moment has exploded. I think there is an enormous amount of links and material in there. This said, Kim had a raised hand for quite some time now. So, Kim.
Thank you. My question is, I'm an Agile coach, and so I help with a lot of transformations mostly around the US, but sometimes international teams as well. And when I'm called in, usually there's a severe lack of psychological safety, such that if you gave this survey to them, they would actually put 5s and 6s in their fear that somehow leadership would know what was being said, and leadership's not happy if you're not happy. So I'm just curious how you account for that as you're giving the survey. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. And in the case we knew that going in, we would have pretty high psychological safety. And that's something we've considered, which is also one of the reasons we're trying to expand. And so early on, we talked about, well, there's definitely a ladder of steps. And I think this is definitely, as you correctly identify, a little higher on. And some of the, oh, apologies, I'm not sure. Yeah. So some of the very, very foundational elements of psychological safety might be missing, then this survey is probably not going to yield as good as a result, and other measures are necessary. And so if we're directly talking about, let's say, a situation like you described, where there's a problem, it sounds more like a leadership problem, maybe, that they're directly afraid of their leaders or whatever the organization structure might be, that might be the first problem to tackle. And so, you know, Amy talks a lot about, for example, acknowledging fallibility or, you know, these kind of things. And if you can get at that from a leadership perspective, and there's interest in the leadership of trying to, you know, let's say they are probably after efficiency, and you can get under their skin that, you know, psychological safety is a driver for efficiency, that might be the place to start. Of course, again, it's a very complicated situation, but yeah.
So what I'm curious about is, if you walked into the scenario and didn't know that it was an unsafe environment, and you gave the survey, the results would be 5s and 6s, and the leadership would say, see, we don't have a problem, we don't need you, we don't need to do anything, we don't need to do training, we don't need to do awareness, everything is fine. So I'm just, that's my curiosity is,
So I would, if I may come back with maybe a challenging point, don't you think that any bottom-up method would fail in the same way then? Any method that you would try to utilize to gather information bottom up would have the same result. So it would be the person that takes the initiative to utilize such an instrument to say, well, this is not appropriate. I think that this is one of the problematic situation of trying to work with companies, is that first of all you need to have your foot in the room and understand what the room says. You cannot say, come in and say, oh, we're going to work on psychological safety. Here is the measurement, the instrument we're going to be using. I think this would be a wrong first step, and we are far from trying to hint at the fact that this would be an approach that we would follow. It's just to showcase what we have tried to do today was to showcase where we are with regards to trying out different approaches. And then it's going to be individuals deciding whether this is an appropriate instrument to utilize in your own context.
Got it. Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And if I can just add one more small comment to that is also we supplemented the survey with some observations. And now, as Paolo, the whole points Paolo mentioned about the motivation for doing all of this is very real and appropriate still. But we had the reason for the observations, which are also part of the original work from medical field that we were inspired by, is also to try and get an outside perspective to some extent of some like quantifiable objective views, right? As much as an objective view you can get from observing someone. But
thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
And we are at the end of our time box here. So I see people are starting to drop off. So I just want to be, while most of you are still here, I want to just again share a link to our little feedback sheet. We really appreciate your feedback. And thank you everyone for taking part in this. I'm sure that Mikkel and Paolo would stay another 5-10 minutes in case you have more questions. But I'll thank you everyone, and particularly to Mikkel and Paolo for bringing up the topic. I think this has been really interesting and insightful. And also thank you to 𝐏𝐬𝐲 for being a co-organizer here.
Yeah, and I also want to say thank you to Paolo and Mikkel. It was really, really interesting and a bit controversial, but that is really where we start. So so thank you for that. Yeah. Super.
And as I mentioned, we will share the slides afterwards, so you will have access to contact information, or if you want to get involved, the links will be in there. And there will also be some resources at the final slide.